Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Brett Davis, the Center Square's Washington State Editor. Joining me today is the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell. How are you doing today, TJ?
I'm doing very well.
So I recently had an occasion to run a lot of errands, which entailed a lot of driving on the state's highways, not always smooth sailing, so to speak. And I noticed there was a lot of signage up touting projects and their supposed benefits. I bring that up because of a recent story you wrote where you talked to a couple of state officials about funding for Washington's transportation system. So per the Department of Transportation in your story, they say there's an annual deficit of $1.1 billion between the funding it needs for maintenance and preservation and what is actually appropriated. How did we get here, and where is all this appropriated money going?
How do we get here? Well, for years, they haven't been funding infrastructure maintenance and preservation, which is different than, say, new projects, because this is stuff that you have to maintain. And preservation and maintenance is also separate issues. There's preservation, and then there's, you're trying to extend the life of like, say, a bridge or a road, and then there's where you need to just replace stuff. And so what's been happening is there's a number of projects that have built up that they need to replace. And it's not just roads and bridges, there's also facilities. According to WSDOT, like roughly 42% or 40% of their facilities are more than 50 years old, or they're just not in good condition. They need to be either upgraded or replaced themselves. So it's just a lot of when we say infrastructure, we mean pretty much anything that WSDOT needs or uses, right, or that they manage, which includes the state roads.
That's almost as old as me, 50 years.
Not quite for me.
Yes, you young people. So I understand there's some other factors involved in this, like the state's gas tax revenue is declining and things like that.
Yeah, so the state gas tax is the primary way that we fund our transportation projects. So there's also bond debt. The state gas tax can only be used for state highway projects. But what's also going on is it's being used to service debt, pay off debt. So in 2020 was 37% of the revenue went towards paying off bonds. And then by 2029, it's expected to be around, it's going to be over 40%, like roughly 44%. So it's going to be eating up a lot of that revenue. I think less than 10 cents goes to WSDOT. Of that revenue out of every dollar. So it's not a lot right now, and it's going to be less and less and less. And then, like you were saying, the revenue is going to be going down because vehicle fuel efficiency has gone up. And then there's going to be the EV vehicles, which don't use gasoline at all, or they're hybrids, and they just don't use anywhere near the level of, say, 1980s pickup truck.
Right. I understand projects are getting more expensive too because the cost of construction and materials is up.
Yeah. So for new projects, construction costs are up, and there's more demand on the roads, and there's more traffic. So you need to build more arterials, you need to build more lanes, you need to build more stuff in order to accommodate them. So there's the demand on the existing infrastructure, but then there's demand from an expansion of that. So they're trying to pay for more projects. However, WSDOT doesn't get to decide what's done with the money. They can only spend that money as it's appropriated by the state legislature. So this is where there's the big debate over, there's a bit of a blame game going on.
Shocking. I also understand from your story that WSDOT, they have a shortage of people.
Yeah, so that's the interesting part also, is they have a shortage of workers. They have a workforce shortage of like 243 full-time employees. And I believe that's maybe for only one program related to preservation and maintenance of highways. And what that has led to, ironically, is a situation where in terms of total funding, WSDOT is getting more funding now than it ever has. And they have this underfunding for maintenance and preservation. However, the state agency is underspending the amount of money that it has had appropriated to it for maintenance and preservation because they aren't able to conduct or carry out as many projects as it'd like because they don't have the people there. So in the 2019-2021 biennium, for those capital projects, preservation, they underspent by almost $200,000.
Government underspending, that seems like something of an anomaly.
It's a very odd and unusual situation where overall, the state agency is getting a ton of money, but it's massively underfunded for preservation and maintenance. And yet it's as of a prior biennium, it's been underspending in that area and because of a workforce shortage.
And your story also mentions the Climate Commitment Act and the carbon auctions, which have brought in $1.4 billion so far, but that money doesn't go to roads, does it?
Yes, and that adds to the I guess you would call strangeness on a surface level, where Washington drivers are paying more in gas prices in part due to this. We also have almost a 50-cent state gas tax, and then you got the federal gas tax on top of that.
It's the fifth highest state gas tax in the nation, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so we've got a high state gas tax, we've got the federal gas tax, and then we've got the Climate Commitment Act, which many argue is contributing to the increase in gas prices. There's some estimates that it adds another 50 cents at this point. So we're paying some of the highest gas prices in the nation as a result of all these things, and yet hardly any of it is going to maintenance and preservation of the existing transportation infrastructure. The Climate Commitment Act stuff is going to new projects such as the electrification of the state ferry system or carbon emission reduction projects. And from what I heard from the governor's office, there's just no chance that they would ever support any use of that revenue for the maintenance stuff.
Right. And I understand the governor's office and some others have accused the legislature of not prioritizing infrastructure preservation.
Yeah. So Governor Jay Inslee proposed delaying new projects due to costs and all this other stuff within the transportation budget. And that riled up a few people, including Democratic, within his own party, state legislators from the areas where these projects would be delayed. So there was a bipartisan effort to reject that proposal, and they enacted this transportation budget with very, very, very strong bipartisan support. And yet Inslee really took them to task when he was signing the bill, saying, I'm signing this because of out of necessity. It's not an endorsement, and you guys failed. You failed to deal with preservation and maintenance stuff. And the director of the State Office of Financial Management, David Schumacher, he wrote a letter during the legislative session saying the same thing. He said these budgets are not adequately funding preservation and maintenance, and we're just not going to be able to, we're not going to be able to meet our need with this budget.
So I'll be curious to see what's in Inslee's supplemental budget this December. I imagine this is going to be an issue for some time to come. So we look forward to more reporting on this in the future from you. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For TJ Martinell, this is Brett Davis. Please subscribe, and thanks for listening.